Welcome to the STEP Conversation series, broadcasted live today from Nantes. I am Miruna Radou-Lefebvre. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at Audencia Business School and head of the chair, Family Entrepreneurship and Society, and I will be your host today, as well as for the next 3 STEP Conversation series, broadcasted live from Nantes from our TV studio. And today, I have the pleasure to be here with our friends and colleagues and co-authors, Christina Constantinidis, Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of Quebec in Montreal Management School and Director of the Observatory of Entrepreneurship and Gender. Hi, Christina. Welcome.
Hi, Miruna. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
I think it's your first time in Nantes and at Audencia.
Yes, and that's wonderful.
Great to have you with us today. And together also with Renaud, an old friend and colleague, Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Institut Supérieur de Commerce in Paris and Director of the Research Lab at ISC. Welcome to Audencia, Renaud. So great to see you again.
I'm very happy to be with you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So today's STEP Conversation series is about gender, about the construct of gender in family business. And we will spend together 1 hour discussing about gender, main ideas and findings. And in terms of timing, we will organize our TV show in 3 sections. So we'll start with a brief presentation together with Christina and Renaud, who are researching gender for more than 2 decades. They will share with us some of the research that they have been undertaking over the last years. And after this brief presentation, we will continue our discussion with you, following us online on our YouTube channel. So please send us your questions online, as well as here in the studio, together with Natalia Verchinina, who's a professor of entrepreneurship at Audencia Business School and head of research in the department Entrepreneurship Strategy and Innovation. Natalia will join us later. So first we will start with the brief presentation, and next we will continue with the discussion. And we will end our TV show today with some publishing opportunities in family entrepreneurship and family business. I hope you'll have a great time with us, and please don't hesitate to send us your questions on YouTube. My colleague will share us with us in the studio. So let's go. Let's start with our first section, the brief presentation of the research on gender in family business, together with Christina and Renaud. We will find you in a few seconds. So before going into more details, I would like to start with a preliminary question, a quite natural question, we may say. Why gender? Why have you decided to study gender more than 2 decades ago? Why not, getting much more focused on other topics, interesting topics in the field of entrepreneurship and family business? So how about you, Christina?
So thank you for the question, Miruna. So I entered the field through my research work on women's entrepreneurship initially, with my PhD a long time ago, and focusing on female entrepreneurs' barriers, difficulties, strategies to be entrepreneurs and to act entrepreneurially. And a decade ago, there was a paradigm shift from an individual lens, focusing on these difficulties and barriers, to a systems perspective, focusing on how gender influences entrepreneurial processes and contexts. And when we talk about context, the family business is tremendously exciting and complex to study because you have at least 2 interrelated systems, the family and the business. And at the heart of these systems, you have gender. Gender influences individuals, how they interact with each other within families and within businesses. It influences families, businesses. And so if we want to understand the complex dynamics going on in family businesses, we have to address the issue of gender. So that's my initial interest in this topic.
Yeah, many thanks, Christina, for offering some background, on your choices, on the choice of gender. So from what I understand, in a sense, is that actually what motivates you is something quite similar regarding what happened in entrepreneurship. You know, when we say that actually doing entrepreneurship is also doing gender quite automatically. So we may say that actually doing family business is also doing gender in an inherent way, and that gender is not just a variable, you know, something we add to our studies. No, doing family business is absolutely automatically doing gender. So many thanks for your insight. How about you, Renaud?
Yes, I've been interested in gender since I was committed to a set of projects that were covering activities of women in Mediterranean Sea. I was working for the UN at that time, and these women were somehow involved in several entrepreneurial programs. Mm-hmm. So I could observe how it was very challenging for them to work in those kinds of contexts. And then when I developed my PhD thesis, I really wanted to study women and leadership, but through an historical lenses. I was interested in the 18th century, and that was part of my big surprise to discover how the story of women had been invisibilized. And then, of course, through that, how the further discourse, the present discourse, the historical discourse, but also the scientific discourse can erase their presence and their tributes. According to this kind of perspective, I've been also very much interested into the political dimension of gender, but as it is embedded within entrepreneurship, because as we can see, most of the time female population are missing resources, help, specific support, and that has been one of my major field of interest during these past 10, 15 years.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand well or no, your interest wasn't only a research or a scholarly focused interest, but also an interest in terms of helping policy building and also practices in the field of business support and entrepreneurship. And what I also hear from your motivation is that what you see behind gender is the social construction of reality and how both men and women communicating together, sharing, working together, living together, actually shape a certain vision of the reality with men and women assigned at specific places, and then they become somehow prisoners of these places. And this may constrain, of course, entrepreneurial action, but also action within the family business context. Many thanks for your insight. So if I summarize, I try to summarize your motivations, what brought you to gender in entrepreneurship, I will summarize it with the final, with a single main question. So if we can see the slide, please. And this question is, how does gender shapes family business dynamics and outcome? And I would also ask you another preliminary question. And this is a question regarding the very definition of gender. What is gender? Actually, and why shouldn't we just use, another close term, that of sex, biological sex? Is it gender the same thing as sex? Why should we study gender, and what is so different, about the specificities of this construct? So I will start maybe with you, Christina, please.
So, yes, it's especially important to distinguish these two notions that are used most often interchangeably in the family business literature. So sex, as you said, is about the biological differences between individuals. Gender was initially introduced by sociologists to identify the socially constructed differences between men and women first, in terms of competencies, for example, attached to one sex or another, in terms of expectations, expected attitudes, expected behaviors that women and men have to comply with. Another example is status or power of women and men in society. But beyond this binary notion of men and women, gender is beyond that, because it is also about how you perform gender, and that can be done in many different ways by different people that can both perform different forms of masculinities and different forms of femininities at the same time or according to context. So that's a more complex construct. And beyond individuals, it also encompasses how sectors of activity, how jobs are gendered, how processes are gender, families are gender. So beyond individuals, you can also study how the processes and activities in entrepreneurship and family business are seen as more masculine or more feminine, depending on the cases. So that's a construct that is very useful to disentangle this family business dynamics.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting what you're saying, Christina, because you're not only distinguished sex from gender by adding this socio-constructivist perspective on the definition of gender, but you also emphasize that behind the notion of gender, we have a set of prescriptions, normative prescriptions, telling men and women how they should actually enact masculinity and femininity. And this is how we shape our societies, this is how we shape our subjectivities, and of course this may become more or less constraining for all individuals. And at the same time, you also said the big word, you said the word power. So behind gender and behind gender studies, there are gender systems, there are power relations among individuals. And the fact that being a man or a woman is not only some social expectation or a social attached to certain social roles, but also implies, embeds power relations and of course performativity. But I'm sure we will address these issues in the next minutes. What I would like to discuss a little bit now with you, Renaud, is this issue of embeddedness. So Christina insisted on the social, cultural embeddedness of gender, speaking about the role of the family, the role of the society, of the different, professions in the definition of particular gender roles. But how about history? Because I suppose, of course, that gender is shaped differently according to the time and space. So, and I know that while you're studying gender for more than 2 decades, researching women, men, minorities, sexual minorities, you are now examining increasingly the role of women in family business. And your aim is to take a historical approach, or I may say an archaeological approach of gender in family business. Can you please tell us more about this approach, Renaud?
Of course. Borrowed from Foucault's work, the archaeological approach is supposed, in a given context, to reconstruct dynamically somehow how a socio-economic role, even a political role or teaching role, for example, has been shaped by different models, different discourses, and different norms. So it's somehow showing something that is extremely relative, not only socio-constructed in the present time, but over time, with different kinds of dialogue between periods. For example, Renaissance and modernity, modernity and post-modernity. And as I've been pretty much involved into postmodern research, I was feeling very important, very urgent to examine historical discourse and narration.
But what are actually the theoretical underpinnings of such an approach, and why do we need Foucault? It may be a provocative question. What do we need Foucault, in family business studies and in relation to gender?
Well, we should take some distance with what is happening today. That's the first point. And with Foucault's work and this archaeological approach, I think we have the possibility to really see what are the big patterns beyond our present observation as sociologists or anthropologists or even psychologists. We need also to understand how people are glued within a specific historical model. I would just mention one, and we're going to talk a little bit later about it. The widow is an important female figure in family business. And let's say I've observed several young women, even though they were not widow and becoming leader, to take that kind of role in 2020, because this has always been in the recent history of the last 500 years, a central female figures in family business.
And concretely, what have you discovered by looking back in time? What are some of the specificities of women's involvement in family business? And what kind of changes have you seen over time?
Well, in Western cultures, and I do insist that it's really focused on this kind of framework, it's important to remember that women were excluded from highly profitable entrepreneurship since the late 15th century, so early Renaissance, for several kinds of reasons. And of course, throughout that, we have seen that three types of involvement could characterize women entrepreneurship after the 16th century and until today. Well, a first group of women were somehow self-employed with with activities that were not very lucrative, such as fishmongers, such as bunch makers. Another, and it was a small proportion, another category of women were developing family co-partnership with their husband, their sons, their father. Well, usually men were supposed to supervise production, whereas women were supposed to supervise commercial activities and bookkeeping. So, of course, there was a strict organization, and it could be important. And the third category was the category of the wife of rich merchants, who played an important role as with their patrimonial contribution, with their possibility of co-manage the business, especially when they become widow, and then, of course, to extend the network and the influence, the political and the territorial influence of the family business. We've got the example of Marguerite Chantoiseau and her correspondence. She was the husband of a rich sheep owner in Saint-Malo in 17th century, and we could see in her correspondence what she could do. And then the last thing that I would stress, that in economic history today, maybe we should challenge a sort of dichotomy, contrasting, women formal power, women informal power in family business. Women formal power were pretty much based on rights of property, but also attributed by law or by the family business articles of association. Whereas women informal power was pretty much characterized by anything based on their competences, such as discernment, legitimacy, commercial know-how, but also their more or less relational pact with their husbands, how you divide the task, and then, even more importantly, I think their deep knowledge of the history of conflict management within and without the business. We can learn a lot when we see them talking about that, especially the printers' widows who write a lot about that.
Excellent. Many thanks, Renaud. We know that if we are not aware of our own history, we risk, to repeat the same errors and to engage in the same patterns. So I suppose that a historical approach, an increase, more focus on historical approaches of family business and of women and gender in family business would be quite necessary for all of us, today. And I will now turn to you, Christina, and we will take a look at your study published several years ago together with our friend and colleague Teresa Nelson, a great review on sex and gender in family business. And maybe we can see the slide with the title. And I would just invite you to tell us a little bit more about the object and the objective of this review.
Thank you, Mirona. So initially, Professor Teresa Nelson and myself, we had been working on family business research for more than 1 decade at least. And we had done many interviews, more than 70 interviews with family business owners and successors, and also some consulting activities. And in our empirical work, we saw very clearly the key role of gender in family businesses. And we had that feeling that family business research did not fully explore or theorize gender as a social construct, not sex. And so we decided to undertake this large literature review, systematic literature review, over 21 years of research to see how sex and or gender ideas were studied and were theorized in the literature. And our two research questions were firstly, how do gender and or sex are studied in the family business literature, and how did it evolve over time? And second question, moving forward, how can a social construction of gender contribute to this family business research field? So this literature review was about family business succession, specifically, which is a major topic in the family business research. So that was our two main objectives.
Wonderful. And I know that actually you focused on also on a historical perspective, actually, of course, by taking this review, trying to take stock on extant knowledge on sex and gender in family business. Have you seen some changes, transformations over the years? And how do young generations, next gen, as we call them, react and act in relation to gender in our societies?
Okay, in terms of changes, if I take a systems perspective, I want to emphasize three main ideas. So, firstly, there is still now a historical male primogeniture rule in family businesses, which means that there is a normative assumptions about the eldest son taking over the family business. And that is just the top of the iceberg, because that relates to patriarchal systems that we will talk about, I'm sure. You know, still ingraining and still rooted in family businesses. So, a few changes from that side. But secondly, what is important to note is that for the 40, 50 last years, there have been evolutions in terms of gender values, gender norms, how we see women and men in society. There has been tremendous changes in society, which affect and which influence the ways family businesses are functioning. And so this transition, this transformation of societal values around gender from the 60s to nowadays is quite difficult to manage for multi-generational family businesses. And they have to cope with this change of values from one generation to another in particular. So yes, there has been changes, but it is still going on, let's say.
I understand. So, in a sense, we may see conflicts in business families and family firms, which are not only due to gender per se, but actually to different coexisting understandings of what it means to behave as a man or as a woman, and therefore we may see these changes reflected at the micro level, but of course occurring also at the macro social level and the family level. Many thanks, Christina, for your this rich insights. What I also read from your presentation is that somehow we still suffer in the family business field somehow from an under-theorizing of gender as such. Am I right?
Oh, yes, indeed. So from our systematic literature review, Teresa Nelson and myself, exposed that, in fact, gender as a social construction, is completely under-theorized in family business research. So to give you a concrete, statistics, on the 157 papers that we analyzed, most of them, 80% in fact, were not considering sex and or gender at all. So they were using sex and or gender terms, yes, but as a variable, and most often a control variable, just comparing daughters and sons, for example, in terms of successor's choice, which is interesting, of course, but they were not discussing, for example, what are the gender roles of sons and daughters in those family businesses, how the male primogeniture rule affects the successor's choice, or how gender equality principles have an impact on these explanations. So these studies lacked really theorization of gender as a social construction. There were some studies that to some extent were taking into account sex and gender ideas. 20 papers were taking into account sex and or gender concepts, but in a limited way. So For example, that could be one sentence saying that there is a male progenitor rule that explains our results, and that's it. So only 13 papers, and I must make clear that our systematic review was in the top journals only, not in emergent journals that are richer in terms of this gender construct. So that was in the dominant literature, the literature that influences our work, in fact, the most. So only 13 papers were considering gender as a social construction, and all of these papers were in the 90s. And yes, and the papers have been written by Colette Dumas, which was the first to study daughters in family businesses. So she wrote half of these 13 papers. So really our conclusion was this under-theorization of gender as a social construction. And we feel that is crucial now to address this question.
Absolutely. Of course, we totally agree with your conclusion. And if I should ask just one idea before going to our second section and entering our discussion with you, watching us from your home or your office online, I would also say that one of the issues that we have to deal with in the family business literature is that we often think about gender as a stable condition of women only, as if the gender was a problem for women only. And what we know from the gender studies literature is that gender, of course, is a characteristic affecting every human being, and men included. There is an emergent literature in entrepreneurship coming from the gender studies and theorizing multiple masculinities, multiple femininities, a literature dealing with doing gender and performativity issues in entrepreneurship and in family business. And I would just like to see the slide with two recent publications. One is a paper we published with Janice Byrne, Sarah Fatum, and Lakshmi Balachandra on the gender gymnastics of both men and female successors in family business. And the second one is a paper published by Janice Byrne, Sarah Fatum, and Thibault, A Suitable Boy, Gender Roles and Hierarchy in Family Business Succession. So just to give an example of such emergent maybe approaches in the field of family business. And to sum it up, I would invite you, Christina, to tell a couple of words about the issue of gender playing at several levels, maybe before going to the discussion, please. So if I understand well, and I think that this is an important idea to keep in mind, is that gender is not only about individual behavior, but that gender is also a structure.
So yes, thank you. Uncovering sons' stories, men's stories is an incredibly fruitful line of research. So thank you for the two papers are wonderful, by the way. And so gender plays at different levels, yes. And we should consider not only, gender analysis at each level, but also how the different levels interact with each other. You have, briefly speaking, you have the societal level where you have institutionalized, socially constructed, but institutionalized gender norms affecting the way we see jobs, sectors of activity, etc. Within this society, you have these families. Family is a powerful institution that can reproduce these gender norms at a family level and contribute to reinforce these gender norms in society. But family can also be a place where you challenge the way gender is seen and performed. So families may decide to act in a more gender egalitarian way, contrary to the society in which they are. So that's possible. Within families, you have social groups. For just an example, the generations. So gender intersects also with generational issues. So the parents and the siblings might not be aligned on the way they see gender, in fact. So the next generation, for example, of daughters, can be really empowered as future successors, while the parents did not expect their daughter to behave that way. The sons, on the other way, might challenge the gender norms and say, I want another career. And within these social groups, you have the individuals, the individual level. And we focus so much on these individual levels and we forget these interactions. Individuals can comply, embrace the gender norms, or they can challenge them and position differently. So that's...
Yeah, absolutely. I feel Renaud wants to add something around this idea of challenging and maybe emancipation from gender norms.
Concerning, this important issue, let's say first, I just wanted to add one thing. It's true, gender is covering a set of issues concerning sex and femininity and masculinity and your possibility to position yourself or even to negotiate what you consider as masculine and feminine in specific kinds of situation, but also design. Let's say the Great Revolution with Butler and the queering movement has been the possibility to see how heterosexual norms were somehow articulating strongly what we could consider the sex, the gender, and the sexual orientation, or even the desire, which is important in entrepreneurship also. And this kind of alignment may be very important in some kinds of family business, because of course there's the necessity also to transmit and to move on over time. So these kinds of things. Well, and therefore it would be important to examine how in this line somehow men who have been in charge of the company were initially not necessarily desiring it, and somehow were developing some kinds of, it would be a sort of psychological approach of the change of their initial motivation once they take the power and their final motivation, and to see that finally they had been constructed as people motivated for that, but they didn't really want it. And you can also see it in some wives entrepreneur who were somehow authorized to develop parallel activities, and were in their correspondence really stressing that they wanted first to see how it works and to see it successful, to see it succeeding. And they really wanted to explore it. And there are many cases that can show this kind of motivation, sex and gender.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Christina and Renaud. We end here our first part of the TV show, our presentation. We're now looking for your questions, so please share with us your questions on our YouTube channel and stay with us online for the next 20 minutes of discussion about gender in family business. Thank you. Hello back. Hello again. We are happy to welcome now in the studio Professor Natalia Verchinina, Professor of Entrepreneurship at Audencia Business School and Head of Research in the Department Entrepreneurship Strategy and Innovation. Welcome, Natalia. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Miruna. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Renaud. It's been such a fascinating discussion already. I'm very excited to join you and continue on this journey to uncover what is gender and why is this important for us, the family business scholars.
Great, great. Many thanks for being here with us. I would like to ask you, what are your first reactions to these studies and ideas that Christina and Renaud just shared with us?
I think the reactions are very clear. I am excited about this field because I think there's a lot to find. There's a lot of opportunity for discovery. However, what is clear so far is that within the context of the studies that have been done, we view patriarchy as influencing the behaviors of individuals within the family businesses, which are really embedded and entrenched with hegemonic masculinity, where family firms and family founders devise a course of action, they lead in a particular way, and this style gets transformed and transferred to next generations. There are certain expectations in terms of behaviors, whether for men, women, or other sexual minorities that have to perform masculinities within this context. And I think this is a very important fact. The other fact, which is quite specific to us as scholars and the scholarship, particularly in relation to some of the work that Christina has done, understanding the whole landscape of the family business research, is that gender somehow, as a term, as a construct, really sticks to women. and no one else in this context. So these are kind of critical constituent parts. But what we know as well is that a lot of the work that has been done looks at women in family business from the perspective of them as an individual, looking at their motivations for getting involved in the family firm, for a particular contextual setting of the family business, whether enabling or constraining, but also externalities that come into play and force or dismiss the existence of other gender.
And what are, for you, Natalia, the questions that we should ask, that we should address in the field of family business? You are studying gender in entrepreneurship, in family business, also in relation to transnational and migrant entrepreneurship for more than 20 years. So what is the top 10, maybe not the top 10, but at least, the top 3 of the most important questions we should ask, start asking more often?
I think that's a very interesting question. Maybe before we move and particularly focus on questions in mind, I think it's important to take into account the really foundational work that argues that we should stop counting bodies. And treating gender as a variable does not help anybody to showcase what is happening. I've been fascinated listening to both Christina and Renaud, and particularly Renaud's perspective of archaeology and what archaeological digging can unearth in terms of the subject matter. I think we need to know more about how past influences the present and how it can potentially influence the future. Somehow we have this capacity to assume that all generations are equally vested in the succession, in the success of the firm, in the longevity of the firm. But what we forget is that most of the people that work in family firms come from different generations. So maybe I'll jump back to Renaud and ask him to comment on these generational differences. Do you think that generational differences may create a new terrain for research activity in family business?
Indeed. First, I would say sometimes we've observing in entrepreneurship research that the difference between men and women having the same kind of background and the same kind of education were somehow less important than the difference between two categories of women. We could observe that between maybe the different categories of generation, and especially between women, but also between men, and their way to perceive the other gender and all the culture of masculinity and femininity, knowing also that I'm sure also that the sector, the industry, the activity of the company may also determine some attachment to the traditional gender roles, and in other industries you have less attachment. That's certainly indeed possible. For example, even though, and I've observed that in fashion or in perfume somehow, the last generation was pretty much better welcoming women than men, and somehow men were also pretty much developing some critical presentation of themselves. So that there were some kinds of sectorial issue, intergenerational issue, and the possibility maybe for this generation to discuss about their heritage and their perception of their heritage. And I'm sure these kinds of workshop or experimentation could be super interesting to develop in family business today.
Absolutely brilliant response. We're going to jump to Christina, of course, to see how her view of the systems change, the transformation that needs to happen or is happening at this point in time, may also influence and be influenced by the history.
Yes, exactly. And if I may add something to what Renaud just said, in the same way that female entrepreneurs are not an homogeneous group, that women are not an homogeneous group, as you said, generations are not an homogeneous group neither. And so there is this need of intersecting gender, generation, but also ethnicity, race, and other variables.
Class, for sure.
Oh, yes, for sure. When we study family businesses. So sorry, I did not answer your question, but I wanted to add that. So the systems, yes, we see some transformations of the systems from more patriarchal models towards more egalitarian models. But the way it is changing, It's not linear. And we have this feeling that we go 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. So that's slow, because patriarchal systems are deeply rooted in our societies, in our Western societies, but not only. And about patriarchy, if I may add something more, it's, as you said, Natalia, it's not about women only. It's about any individual that does not comply with hegemonic masculinity in a given culture. This individual will be excluded or devalorized in a given system. So that's extremely important to see what is happening with minorities, sexual minorities, visible minorities, some ethnic groups as well. So when we think about how to transform the system, because these groups, I believe that they can be also a lever of change in family businesses.
Absolutely. I totally agree, Christina. Maybe just a word on the notion of hegemonic masculinity, which might not be so familiar to those doing research in family business. So this notion has been developed by Connell in gender studies a few decades ago. And according to her, hegemonic masculinity is a set of discourses and practices that we enact in our societies as both men and women. And this set of discourses and practices installs a certain kind of masculinity, which she calls hegemonic, endowed with attributes such as aggressivity, competitiveness, power, determination, a lack or an inability to show vulnerability. And this kind of masculinity is imposed as a norm on both men and women. And men suffer too, actually, from this confrontation to this unattainable norm or ideal to some. And for some scholars more recently today, this hegemonic masculinity is also attached to neoliberalism. So it's a certain kind of political and ideological pressure that we put on both men and women in our societies, assigning men and women to a certain ideal and to certain behaviors, and therefore is a form of constraint from which all individuals suffer, and which of course structures our families, firms, and cultures overall. Maybe we should also discuss a little bit another notion attached to this notion of hegemonic masculinity and to the notion of power. And this is the question of visibility and invisibility. So this notion also appears in your speech today. I listened to you, Natalia, you pronounced the word visibility. Renaud also discussed about invisibility, about informal and formal power, which are of course attached to this issue of visibility. And you touch upon visibility, of course, Christina, in your own presentation. So what do we mean by visibility or invisibility regarding women, but also regarding alternative forms of gender enactment in family business? Maybe, Renaud, you want to add something?
Visibility and invisibility, of course, I told you that men were usually supervising production and women were supervising commercial activities in the Ancien Régime. However, concerning the Industrial Revolutions period, we've got a set of very interesting documents that help us to see how women were extremely involved, not only in the innovation, but also in the innovations of family business, but also their commercialization, which was pretty much important. There were different kinds of big conference and public places in which women were showing what their company or even themselves had been innovated. We've got 2 examples, because in terms of the memory of the family business, the fact that a woman has innovated is not still a usual thing, and they need to have a certain age. I'm going to give a positive example and a negative example briefly. The negative example is the example of Elizabeth Puck-Barker, who had the privilege to file the patents of the commercial use of rubber in the 1830s in France, and she created a business with her husband, let's say, because she couldn't have done it alone at that time, that was pretty much focused on the production of balls for children's game. This lady is the grandmother of Edouard Michelin and his brothers who have founded the Michelin Stars, and let's say that Michelin Stars has moved from a business game, from a company that was producing games for kids to a company that was somehow much more focused on masculine sector that helped to develop industry and cars. And of course, in the story of the family Michelin, the memory of these ancestors is completely erased. We can't find it. Just in contrast and briefly, we have Marie-Louise Sensitive Armfield. Well, she was the daughter of an entrepreneur, an English entrepreneur established in France, and she was the widow of a French entrepreneur. She was supervising the production of Toile de Mayenne, and she has really increased the quality of this kind of fabrics during the mid-19th century, changing few times the type of production and developing new patterns. That was really, and she is in the memory of the family.
Oh, wonderful. So maybe a last question before jumping to your questions or remarks. I see that we already have one comment, and I would ask you a short answer because we try to keep our 1 hour duration. If we should start today, as a PhD student, start today studying gender in family business, what kind of theories should we use more? So maybe one word, one proposition. Come on, who wants to start? Please, Christina.
So I start. There are plenty of theories. Gender theories is a very rich field. So one, I like the gender roles theory, which has been studied for many decades in sociology, since the 50s, in fact. Gender roles theory, let's take, many theorists have worked on that. If I take one, Ridgway's theory, for example, in 2004, works on the gender expectations theory, which associates competencies and status with one gender or the other. So you can use this theory to analyze how status and competencies are divided between men and women, and that goes back to the notion of power, which is really important. How the power is distributed between men and women in family businesses could be extremely fruitful line of research. For sure. That's one gender theory, just one, we said. And what I want to add is also a tremendous rich work on implicit gender roles theory, which is about the malleability or fixedness of gender norms in society. And that could be really interesting to dig into that from a systems perspective in the family business research field.
Wonderful. And I know that Renaud also wanted to suggest another one, a few words.
Yes, like I think one of an interesting approach would be the performativity theory. Why? Because in performativity theory, you not only study narration, but quotation. How quotation are produced, used, what are their structure, and how much they glue with the identity with the male and female identity of heirs in a family business. I think that would be a really important domain to explore and investigate as quick as we can. Well, we need to work on archive also, and there's a lot of work.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. And how about you, Nat?
Of course, I have something to add. I wanted to possibly respond to this question by setting an agenda for complete rethink of the work that has been done. And it doesn't negate the work that has been done in family business, but it offers us an opportunity to have a critical view and review what we've done and all the theories that we've used, using this gender perspective, gender-aware perspective. Simone de Beauvoir, may I quote, we are in France at the end of the day, said that our presentation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men. They describe it using their own point of view, but they confuse it with the absolute truth. And it's not a stab at men as scholars in general. It's the fact that patriarchy and the hegemonic masculinity is so entrenched. It's interwoven, interlacing everything that we do. We need to rethink the language. We need to be more reflective of the terminology, of the words that we use, because they are absolutely rooted in this very difficult struggle-based, constantly demoralizing and marginalizing landscape, which doesn't reveal the realities of the struggles, and nobody wants to hear a bad story.
Yeah. So, in a sense, what you're also suggesting is that words do the world, and we should also engage more with language when studying gender in family business, because it is through these very words that we construct our reality and that we construct our families and our firms. And before going to our last section around publication opportunities, I would like just to quote some of our colleagues following us online. So I see Pablo Dominguez. He says, I think one of the main contribution of women in family business is to transmit the family values to the organization. And Jeremy Chang, he says, in Asia, I can see that male aren't the only one who reinforce the hegemony. The irony is that female also replicate the gender role because this is so much embedded in culture. And he asks, how can we better raise the awareness of gender-neutral practice from the social constructivist view? Is this possibility even a real one? And he also asks, what are the research opportunities in the family business field when the concept of gender evolves over time?
And what a beautiful kind of initial reaction is quite interesting. So there is, I think we live in the world which is full of ivory towers, and there is no world in which we can develop gender neutrality.
Exactly.
So we have to accept the fact that there are problems in what we do, and we need to be real archaeologists of our future. Not only of the past, but of our future, in which we will build the theories that are representative of all different types of family firms that are not just based in the Western societies, but also representative of peculiar, very specific, possibly different types of cultures and tribes, where language plays a role in representing certain individuals and shows the power relations that exist and the dynamics that is happening, but also takes into account the complete transformation over time of all these firms. But we are the carriers of this knowledge. So I think it's really important that we make a difference in what we do.
Oh, it's a beautiful word for the end of this second discussion section. Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia, Christina, and Renaud. We are now jumping to our last minutes. The jingle, please. So just 3 minutes for the publication opportunities. Before going into the publication opportunities, I would like to display the book that Natalia and her colleagues just published last year, a book entitled Global Migration, Entrepreneurship and Society, Contemporary Issues in Entrepreneurship Research. And this book won the Literati Award winners. We are so proud of you
so
for outstanding author contribution. So wonderful. We are so glad and happy to have you with us, Natalia. And now, just 4 news about publication opportunities. The first one is a call in Academy of Management Perspectives on Echoes of the Past, capturing the influence of legacy on individuals, families, and organizations. With a deadline on March 1st, we are working on, together with my co-editors, Gideon Markman, Jim Davis, Bill Gardner, Sarah Jack, and Alfredo De Massis. And a second one is a conference, and I hope I will see many of you there next week in Cork. It's the Family Business Management annual workshop entitled Family Reunion, Reconnecting and Rebuilding. So in Cork next week with several chairpersons, Linda Murphy from Cork University together with her colleagues, as well as colleagues from GIBS, Massimo Bau and Kaisa Haag. Another one, Academy of Entrepreneurship here in France, donc Académie de l'entrepreneuriat et de l'innovation, which will take place next June in Strasbourg, France. And here we have a workshop track together with Céline Baredi, Didier Chabot, and Eddie Ezard, who are STEP members and members of the Chair Family Entrepreneurship and Society at Audencia. So, yeah, please submit your papers there also. And I will end with a last call, Journée Georges Doriot, organized by Christina Constantinidis, Alain Bloch, and Nazik Fadil in Montreal next July on the topic of gender and entrepreneurship. So, yeah, I'm sure, Christina, you want to see us in number in Montreal, yes, in July.
We're all invited.
We are all invited, yeah. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you to our audience, to our colleagues watching us from home or from their offices. So here ends our second STEP Conversation series, organized by Audencia Business School and broadcasted live from our TV studio in Nantes. I'm grateful and happy to have you with us today, Natalia, Christina, and Renaud. Please let me also address my warmest thanks to those without whom this wouldn't be possible. Of course, Raina Romey, who's our colleague in the studio, together with Jean-Philippe Picara from Audencia Business School, as well as Arpita Vyas from the STEP Consortium project. I hope you will join us for the next STEP Conversation series, which will take place at the beginning of the next year. And I wish you a wonderful end of the week.